What are 5 things about the Sony FX30 that
perhaps could be better?
Before we get into that, I've had this camera for about a month, I think. It's crazy how time flies, but overall, I really enjoy this camera. I'm having a lot of fun using it, having a lot of fun shooting with it. I'm shooting on it right now, so you know. That's the Sony 35mm f1.8. So on this camera, it's kind of like a 50mm-ish field of view. So I wanted to give you an idea of how it looks. I want to get the negatives out of the way in its own discrete video. And later on, I'll do a positives video, things about the camera that don't suck. So stay tuned for that. So let's get into it. Number 1 thing about the Sony FX30 that
stinks
is the sensor. Number 2 is, okay, wait, hold on. Before we move on, what is it about the sensor that actually
blows?
It doesn't have the sort of like wow factor that you might be looking for, and that I do think that exists in a competing camera that's a little bit more expensive, but not too much more expensive, depending on which FX30 you get. That camera is the Fujifilm X-H2S. So that also has a brand new APS-C or Super 35mm sensor, and in my opinion, it's a much more impressive sensor technology than the one in the FX30. It's a slow reading sensor, so you will see some rolling shutter, so that could bite you in certain situations. Secondly is the dynamic range is okay, but it's not great. A lot of people might say, well, it's to be expected, an APS-C or Super 35mm sensor is probably or will have less dynamic range than a full frame, but that's not necessarily true. I think the X-H2S, for instance, probably beats some of the full frame cameras on the market. And then if you go up to a lot more expensive cameras like the Canon C70, the C300 Mark III, those Super 35mm sensors also probably have more dynamic range than some full frame cameras. So it's not a fait accompli that Super 35 has less dynamic range. I don't know if I said that right. It just popped in my head. I'm going to edit that out. The number 2 thing is the 4K 120 crop. The reason that this
needs improvement,
obviously, is that it has a massive crop. So any lens that you have on the camera, if you're shooting in 24 or 60 frames per second and you switch over to 4K 120, it's going to punch in a lot. It's giving you a 1-to-1 readout for 4K. So it's punching all the way into 3840 by 2160, down from 6K, whatever that is. So it's good in a way because you're getting a full 4K readout. The image quality is nice, but it is a massive crop on top of what it was previously. And secondly, the noise is much more noticeable in the 120 mode than in the 60 and 24 and 30 frames per second modes. Even in scenarios where there's plenty of light outdoors, you will see noise in the shadows. So you either have to just accept that it's noisy or try to do some kind of noise reduction in post-production. It would be really hard to use in a studio environment if you wanted to shoot some B-roll. A, because the crop is going to be really tight, and B, you'll have to have a ton of light to deal with the noise. The number 3 thing that
perhaps could be better
is there's no burst mode. I know that this is positioned as a cinema camera, but it essentially isn't any different than any of the other 6000 or alpha cameras from Sony, just a slightly different body and no viewfinder and no shutter in this one. But other than that, it could have a burst mode. It just doesn't. Maybe that's to keep the price down. Maybe that's to make sure that whenever the 6000 camera that has the same sensor in this one, you buy that one instead, or you buy 2, whatever. But the FX3, for instance, same body, same cinema line marketing, etc., has the same exact photo capabilities as the A7S III, so burst mode is included in that camera. Maybe you don't have any desire to have multiple cameras, so you want a do-it-all camera, and this is a perfectly good photo camera, minus a viewfinder and minus the burst mode. It's a cinema camera, but there's no shutter angle, there's no waveforms, there's no false color, there's no aspect ratio other than 16:9, and really a cinema camera should at least have DCI 4K and 2K, if not open gates. I'll just say this last one, of course I'm not expecting it in this body, but also with this price range, but there's no NDs. And for a cinema camera not to have NDs is not unheard of, but it would be nice. It would be more cinematic. Okay, the last thing that
no bueno
is the top handle. And the reason that the top handle
needs improvement
is that it's just kind of dorky. And the reason it's dorky is the form factor looks like it was designed by a kindergartner. It's very plasticky, or it's completely plasticky. It doesn't feel all that great in the hand. The handle itself is okay, but the actual XLR module, yeah, it's kind of creaky and flimsy feeling. The top handle isn't long enough really to fit all of your fingers on it. It's not contoured very well for your fingers. There's not a lot of mounting points to it, which is kind of a nice feature of top handles. So those are the 5 things about the FX30 that suck. As I mentioned at the beginning, I do really like this camera. There's more things about it that I like that I don't like, but I wanted to get the negatives out of the way. So stay tuned for the 5 things, or maybe more, that I like about the FX30. I'm also going to do some additional content, probably going to do a comparison against the A7 IV, which camera I'm going to keep, because I really do think of these 2 cameras, one of them's got to go. I think I know which one, but maybe making the video will cement my thinking. I'm also going to make a video with the Atomos Ninja 5, testing out the raw capabilities of the FX30. I'm kind of interested in that because I know that there's going to be a significant downside to it, and we'll get into that. It's not necessarily the FX30's fault. I think it has more to do with the Atomos, but we'll look at that. And also, I would like to compare the 120p modes in the FX30, the A7 IV, and the A7S III. So if you're interested in all that stuff, stay tuned. Anything I missed, anything else that sucks that you would like to let everybody know, please leave them in the comments. As always, appreciate you watching the video, and see you later.